Hello, everyone. We're just waiting a moment just so that all our participants can come in. It sometimes takes a moment, so we'll get started in just a few moments here while we just let all our attendees get in here. Okay. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's online charter series on COVID contact tracing apps, hosted by the Center for Constitutional Studies at the University of Alberta. We're so pleased to have you all joining us today. My name is Alina Rietzma. I'm the Center's Public Legal Education Coordinator, and I'll be moderating this session for us today. As this is a webinar, many audience members, many of you watching, might be from different places across Canada. You might be from even different places across the world. So I'd really encourage you to reflect upon the land at your respective location, wherever you are, and think on those who came before you, who called and continue to call that land your home, or their home, sorry, as I respectfully acknowledge that the Center for Constitutional Studies is located on Treaty 6 territory, an ancestral gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux, and Inuit peoples, and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to structure and ground our shared vibrant community today. So before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the format of the webinar and handle some housekeeping today. So first, you'll note that the chat function for the webinar has been disabled, but you can still ask questions of our speakers. You'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you can click that, enter your question, and send it to us, and we'll see it. You and the other attendees won't be able to see it, but you can be rest assured that we'll see it. Each presenter is going to be speaking for about 20 minutes each. And so there should be plenty of time to answer questions after that. And once all the presentations are complete, we're going to answer as many questions as we can within the time that we have available. I'd also just note, for when the webinar is over, you're going to receive a pop-up to go to a feedback form or a survey after the presentation today, and we'd really appreciate it if you would take just a few moments to fill it out, give us your feedback. It's extremely valuable to us. And lastly, please do note that this webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be available on our website and YouTube within a few days after the webinar today. So today we're going to be discussing COVID contact tracing apps, and these apps have been used, and different types of apps have been used by many different governments to try to address the issues with COVID tracing. Our presentation today will begin with Professor Joel Reardon. He's going to explain how different COVID contact tracing apps work, and is going to discuss some of the security and privacy issues related to those apps. And then Professor Emily Laidlaw is going to discuss privacy concerns from a legal perspective, and she's also going to examine, in particular, the extent to which the Charter of Rights and Freedoms could provide a framework to address some of these risks, talking about some of the Charter privacy provisions and their applicability, including their limits to addressing the privacy interests for users traced by these apps. And she's also going to be discussing some of the issues beyond the Charter. As I understand it, these are some of the bigger issues why, so she'll also discuss that as well. Both of our presenters today are wonderfully qualified to discuss these issues. Professor Reardon is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Calgary, and he has a PhD in computer science from ETH Zurich. His book on secure data deletion was published in 2016 by Springer as part of a series on information security and cryptography. And he's researched and published numerous papers on the topic of security and privacy issues, particularly with respect to smartphones and apps. He's also given a number of presentations on this and provided interviews to the media. And in fact, he was recognized as a Peak Scholar at the University of Calgary in 2019 with respect to improving mobile privacy. So he has a whole bunch of knowledge and experience to share with us. As well, Professor Emily Laidlaw, she's an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. She's a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law. She completed her LLM and PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science and taught at the University of East Anglia Law School before she came to the University of Calgary. And her research interests include cybersecurity and information technology law, among other areas. She's a member with the Center for Creativity, Regulation, Enterprise and Technology, the managing editor of the European Journal of Law and Technology, and advisor for the Law Commission of Ontario, Defamation Law in the Age of the Internet, along with papers, book chapters, various presentations. Her book, Regulating Speech in Cyberspace, Gatekeepers, Human Rights, and Corporate Responsibility, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. So as you can see, our speakers come with a great deal of knowledge and experience and background to be able to talk to us about these issues today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Reardon for his presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. All right, mobile phones. These things that basically didn't exist about a decade ago and now are in the hands of everyone at all times. And people like them. They're great because they connect to routers and they can get access to the internet through them, and they can connect to cell phone towers to make phone calls as well as to get access to the internet. And they're able to receive GPS signals, and by doing that, they're able to know their location, which is quite useful as well, and do all sorts of location-based services. So useful tools for sure. But it's not just users that are benefiting from this, because this type of information is also quite interesting to advertisers and analytics companies that like to collect the information about the cell phone towers that are near you, or the Wi-Fi routers that you happen to be connecting to, or what your current location is and your location at all times. This is of interest to these companies because they can take this data and make money off of it in a variety of different ways. Of course, the user doesn't really notice that they're just playing some game, or they have some app on their phone that's actually responsible for doing this sort of data collection. And this is the primary means by which apps monetize in the ecosystem of mobile apps. So the app maker is paid by these third-party libraries that are included that do some sort of ads and analytics work behind the scenes, and the user doesn't really observe that. They just see the app that they're using. So now we reach 2020, and the idea was to take these phones, which are in the hands of everyone, so they're already basically deployed, and use them to do a digitally enhanced form of contact tracing in the context of COVID-19. So the idea being that if two phones happen to be near each other, it implies that the pockets and purses of the people who own these phones happen to be near each other. So even if they're strangers, if the phones can talk to each other, then it can be digitally recorded as a proximate encounter that has occurred. The technology to do this is Bluetooth, and you may be familiar with Bluetooth. It's usually used for body area networks. It's for connecting your headphones to your cell phone or game controller. If you've ever been in a car and someone's phone was using Bluetooth to play on the radio and they step out of the car, you'll notice that the signal drops pretty quickly. So Bluetooth is a well-suited technology for this sort of idea of proximate encounters. If you're close enough to hear Bluetooth, then you're close enough to the person to possibly catch COVID-19. So the premise by which these contact tracing apps work is that these phones are just broadcasting random identifiers. They don't uniquely identify the person, they're just constantly changing, so they look random-like. They aren't immediately associatable to a person. And the phones just keep track of everything that they can hear. So each phone will have its own record of all the things that it heard from other phones as it's going about the day in grocery stores or on a bus or something like that. And so if each phone has these random things, these random looking things, they actually correspond to an encounter that they've had with somebody else. Now, they can't identify who that person is, but each one represents an encounter, and some might represent a risky encounter, an encounter from someone who later, for instance, tests positive for COVID-19. So the idea of this contact tracing is that the phone can make this risk assessment by recording its encounters and then later assessing which ones happen to be risky. Now, there's two main ways that this is implemented. The first we can call the centralized approach. And the centralized approach works where every phone registers with some central authority using a veronym, like their name or their phone number for something. And then they're responded back with a text message that allows them to enter into the app. And then the central authority as well will then tell them all the random looking things to say and when to say them. So each phone is instructed to say this random thing at this time, say this random thing at this other time, and so forth. Then it keeps a record. The central authority records every single identity of the person and everything that they would say, everything that they were told to say. Then what happens is the phones talk amongst themselves, and at some point someone contracts COVID-19. When this occurs, they upload everything that they've ever heard to the central authority, which means that they upload all of the proximate encounters that they have had. The central authority knows exactly who those people are, so they're able to immediately de-anonymize them, figure out who they actually are, who these people that this person who contracted COVID-19 actually interacted with, and then issue them an alert saying you may have been put at risk of COVID-19, you should get a test or something to that effect. So in effect, a problem with this approach, and when we think about it in terms of privacy, is that when a phone uploads all of this data to the central authority is able to immediately figure out exactly who those people are. So in effect, the central authority learns a record of who a person who contracted COVID-19 met, even if that other person is never contracting COVID-19. So another person who doesn't actually contract the disease, their privacy is also infringed upon this because they are the ones who then might get notified by the central authority. So it's not just those who contracted who are at risk, but rather everyone who's using it who has some privacy loss. As well, there's a central point of failure, and this is a typical reason why in security we want to avoid these centralized solutions, which is that if there is someone malicious at the central authority, or if the database gets attacked by attackers, then a lot more privacy is leaked. It's not just the central authority who knows all of these identities and when who met with who. It's now up to various attackers who are able to compromise this information. And then two more problems as it relates to control over information. So in this case, when Alice, for instance, sends a random message to Bob so as to indicate a proximate encounter, Alice then loses control over whether that ever gets reported to the central authority. So Alice, there's nothing she can do anymore to stop it from happening. It's entirely up to Bob whether Bob reports this information to the central authority or not. So Alice loses control over that information. And the second aspect of information self-determinism is that it's up to the central authority whether or not to warn Alice. And presumably there's going to be some calculation there because a central authority that only generates false positives will soon be recognized as, well, this app just isn't working, right? So the central authority has an interest in not having an overwhelming number of these alerts correspond ultimately to false positives. And as well, the central authority isn't aware of Alice's own risk calculation. Maybe Alice has a heightened risk and wants to be warned more aggressively in case anything is to be concerned about, whereas the central authority is the one who's deciding whether or not Alice is ultimately warned. So for context, this is the approach that the Alberta Trace Together app uses, this centralized government-controlled implementation. Now, the motivation to create a decentralized approach is to remove the central authority so that we don't have this central point of failure and we don't have these privacy issues. So in this case, the decentralized approach, Alice and Bob function as before, and they independently decide what to say. So they just come up with a bunch of random things to say and when to say it, but they're not told what to say by the central authority. They just decide on their own, and they're the only ones who actually know what they're going to say. And it's, we don't need to go into the cryptography, but there's a way of doing it with these secret keys, with the ultimate behavior being that if you know the secret key, some key for Alice, a key for Bob, you're able to reconstruct everything Alice would have said. But without the secret key, and even with various messages that Alice did say, you're not able to figure out that key. So this is a standard cryptographic technique that we can use. And the way this then works is that Alice will hear a bunch of things from a variety of phones, and these 5 might have come from the same entity, and if Alice had that key, she would know, and these 4 may have come from another, but without the key, they all just look independently random, that you can't link the different broadcasts to a same particular phone. So in this approach, every user has their own secret key, and there's still a central authority, but it's now just a health database that curates the keys that correspond to people who have later tested positive for COVID-19. So in this case, if Bob contracts COVID-19, it informs the health authority, and the health authority curates the list of all of the keys corresponding to what would be at-risk encounters. And each phone on their own can ask for what are all the keys that have been published, get the keys, then on their own devices, looking at their own database, never having shared any of this information, perform a risk analysis, decide which of these They can reconstruct all the random things that they would have heard, the random utterances that these phones would have spit out. And had they actually been around to hear it, they would then see it in their database. And from that, can do their own risk calculation. So this phone would be able to tell, I've had 7 risky encounters, and they would also be able to link them now because these identifiers are linkable, because with the key, you can now link them all and say, they came from the same 2 people. For context as well, this is the approach that is used for the Canada contact tracing app, and it's also the one that is this Google Apple exposure notification, which is ultimately, if you'll have to use this system in order for it to work, because on the iPhone, for example, you have to be constantly running the app in the foreground with your phone on for it to really work, unless you're working with Apple using their framework. So this is the standard approach now that's been adopted by a bunch of countries. And it superficially looks better for privacy, but we're going to get into a bit of the details there. So there's 2 known attacks on the system, the decentralized approach. The first is that, well, you can say that you need to be near a device in order to hear them, but there's ways around that. So for instance, if the attacker had a high energy broadcasting tower, they could emit a very loud, in a sense, noise that a lot of phones in an area would hear. And all of these phones, if it turns out later that corresponded to a positive case, that identifier, then all these phones would then get a fake alert, right? And this can happen because an adversary can just rebroadcast information they've heard. They can listen for a signal, for instance, they can collect beacons at a hospital or a COVID testing facility where they're going to likely lead to at-risk encounters later, and collect this information, learn that, and then promptly rebroadcast it somewhere else. Say they want to shut down some economically vital industry for some particular reason, they can then broadcast it at this industry, causing a fake outbreak by rebroadcasting these identifiers that would later be turned out to have come from a positive source encounter. So this is, in a sense, violating this assumption that you have to be within 2 meters for Bluetooth to work. In practice, it's not like that at all. Now, another attack is what we call a De-Anonymization Attack. And so here we have the city, an illustration of the city of Calgary with the Bow River and the mountains in the background. And in the city, suppose that there's an office worker, Bob, who's at the office, and he's broadcasting some identifier at some time, and later he's at a cafe, and in the evening he's home. And if an adversary were able to scan the entire city somehow, be able to receive all of the Bluetooth broadcasts for an entire geographic area, they would learn Bob's information. And suppose they had multiple antennas so they could triangulate this, they would learn the location as well. And they could track Bob as he goes through town. Now, the thing is, they would be collecting information on everyone, meaning that they wouldn't know that it's Bob. They would just see random things all over town. This is by design. But also by design is when the central authority publishes Bob's key, everyone can reconstruct what Bob would have said, which means that someone who is collecting this information is also able to reconstruct what Bob would have said. And if now you have a location history for an entity, I would argue that goes a great deal in towards de-anonymizing them, particularly if you have where they are working all day and where they're sleeping all night, you've done a great reduction in the number of possible people that could be. So this is a sort of accidental consequence of the decentralized approach, is that now you're not just making your broadcast linkable to some central authority, but you're making them linkable to anyone. And if someone had priorly collected that information and linked it to something like your location, now they're able to de-anonymize you. Now, an observation that we make is that the phone itself is the perfect weapon to mount these attacks. So we don't actually need high gain antennas or high energy broadcasting towers. We can just have lots and lots of phones, because the phone has Bluetooth so as to receive the information, these contact tracing signals, and record them. The phone has GPS, so the phone can annotate where they receive those with location. And the phone has internet, so it can upload them all to the adversary's controls to some cloud server somewhere that the adversary is then able to do all of their analysis. So the phone is actually the perfect weapon to mount these attacks. And so now we can imagine that this hospital attack with a rebroadcasting to shut down some economically vital industry, this can be done by having people in the hospital, their phones collecting this information, people at the factory, their phones being the ones that are broadcasting it out and causing the fake outbreak. And a key point here is that this can be done entirely extra-jurisdictionally. There was an argument put forth for these against these attacks happening by some of the countries that deployed them, in particular Switzerland, that said, well, this attack can happen. Of course, they knew that high-energy broadcasting towers and high-gain antennas existed, but they argued, well, the adversary won't buy them, they're too expensive, and even if they did, we would see them and they would have to be in our country and we could use a legal system to punish them. But if the attacker is just having code running in other people's phones to collect this information, and then having code in other people's phones to broadcast that information, this attack can be done without any actual footprint in the country that's affected. And as well, we imagine in our town example, the adversary can just use people's phones to receive all of this Bluetooth signal from all over town all the time, uploading it all to their control to then later do de-anonymization attacks as well. And there's another attack that we thought of when we were analyzing this, which we called the Biosurveillance Attack. And the idea here is that in the same way that you can't opt out of GPS, GPS is just part of the ambience. It's a signal of radio waves that just broadcast the time. And if you have a GPS receiver, you're part of the GPS system, whether or not you want to be or not. In the same way, having an ecosystem where phones are broadcasting medical information around all the time means you can't really effectively opt out of it if you're capable of receiving this information, or if someone happens to just be next to you and they're the ones that are listening to all this information and recording what you would hear, they can also aggregate all this information, upload it to a server, and then when the information about which encounters correspond to sick encounters is published, do a risk assessment on your behalf, figuring out what your actual risk is and so forth. Basically functioning as a contact tracing app, even if you're not part of the system, even if you think, well, I've opted out, I didn't install it. The point is that this medical information is now still just part of the atmosphere around you, whether or not you wanted that to be the case. So the conclusion being that in order for the adversary to mount these attacks, they don't need this high specialized equipment, they just need lots and lots and lots of phones. But that still seems like quite a challenge. So what can the adversary do? Well, this is where this ecosystem of surveillance capitalism comes to help the attacker, because it turns out that, for instance, here's an app and it has 100 million installations. And when I was doing analysis on it, I found that it was uploading all of the Bluetooth data, low energy broadcasts that are made. So exactly the kind of information that these contact tracing apps are using. And it was uploading all of this information from all of these users from 100 million installations, and it's running in the background and uploading everything it hears over time to the servers controlled by whoever wrote this code. Because as we already have companies collecting your GPS and collecting router information, collecting cell tower information, so Bluetooth beacons, this is just another kind of information, and these companies are also interested in it. And I found that two companies, Xmode and In Loco Media, they were both collecting exactly this kind of information that would, in effect, widely facilitate these attacks. Now, to be fair, they weren't actually collecting the necessary information, but it would have been a one-line change. So it's not the case that we could say, oh, this is too hard to do or would never be done. It's actually quite easy to do. They just didn't happen to be doing exactly that, but in a large amount of the work was basically already done on the attacker's behalf. Now, In Loco Media actually stopped collecting this information after it got used for medical purposes, but Xmode doubled down. So in Xmode's case, if you looked at their privacy policy, they say quite plainly, they collect Bluetooth low energy devices in your proximity, relative location information from these devices. And when do they collect it? When you're using the app and when you're not using the app. So basically, as long as your phone's running, they're collecting this information. Why do they collect it? A number of different reasons, but I found C quite interesting. C for disease prevention and research, security, anti-crime, and law enforcement. And the reason I say Xmode doubled down is because that was actually added, this disease prevention part was added after we started using this information in the context of COVID tracing apps. A previous version of the privacy policy had made no mention of that. Now, again, as I mentioned, Xmode is not collecting this information to do these attacks that we talked about. The point I was making is rather that these attacks are much easier to do than had been argued by Google and Apple and other jurisdictions that had put forth these apps. And it turns out that actually Exmo was collecting this to sell it to the US military, and I was working with a journalist at the Wall Street Journal to do a story related to this, that in fact they are collecting this information for selling to the government. And it turns out that Senator Wyden was not pleased about that and issued a letter to Google and Apple, and Exmo has now been banned from both their stores for collecting this sort of location. That's all I wanted to say about that. The conclusion, I guess, to say is that while the decentralized version actually seemed to be much better for privacy, it actually can, in a sense, be much worse depending on exactly what your attacker is. And in a sense, the only protection we have is to make sure that, well, we managed to stop Xmode from doing this, but there's going to be others, and there are others, and it's a matter of making sure that we're finding them all and stopping this sort of collection from happening, and ending a sense of this surveillance capitalism would go a long step towards making that a reality. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Reardon. So Professor Laidlaw, if you want to put your slides up and go ahead.
Absolutely. Okay, let me just get this going. I'm still.
Yeah, it's not letting me to close it, so I will.
Professor Laidlaw, you should be able to share, and then it'll stop Professor Reardon's sharing.
Ooh, the power. Okay, let's do this. Share. There we are. Does everyone see it? Okay, so that was fascinating. Listening to
Professor Laidlaw, I don't see it yet.
I was screen sharing. Sorry, everybody, bear with us while we figure out the little techie bits. So I am sharing like I normally do, but it still says that I'm viewing Joel Reardon's screen. So if Joel, you're able to stop sharing, then I should be okay.
There we go.
I will try. Can you see now?
Not yet. Maybe try one more time.
Sure.
Oh, I think it's starting. There you go.
It's working now. Okay. And do you see it fully as my slides? Yeah.
We're seeing the presenter view right now.
Okay. Here, let me end my show and start my show again. Here we go. There we go. We're good to go, right?
It's still presenter. I don't know why, but.
I don't know why it's doing that as well, because I have it as a full screen for me. Everyone, look at this. We're here to talk about techie things, and I'm still facing these issues. So I'm going to try one more time, and otherwise I might ask you to share it. So let me try one more time. Here we go. And play from the start. Does this work?
It's still presenter. So if you want, would you like me to share them, and then you can just tell me when to switch?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. I don't know why this is happening, but it's showing on my screen everything is going perfectly. But you know, while you're setting that up, I maybe can tell everyone that someone else said that they could see my screen. You know, I found it interesting because Dr. Reardon and I, and along with our colleague in the law department here, Greg Hagan, wrote about contact tracing apps really early on in the pandemic. So I know that it was shared with you, the blog post we wrote in April. And so for me, it was fascinating hearing some of the technological developments. And in fact, I think that it shows a widening gap between what he is finding through these technological assessments and some of the legal discussions that have been happening. So I hope that maybe provokes some interesting conversations and questions arising out of this. And I'm sure between Dr. Reardon and I after this is over. So let's look at the legal side of contact tracing apps and the privacy and the charter. There's a few things I want to have you take away from today. One is just to learn a little bit about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I think key here is also its limits to address some of the issues we're looking at today. And the second is also to learn a little bit about just the legal and theoretical model of privacy, what privacy is, and the narrower ways that law protects it. And so the short answer for today really is that we are operating entirely in a gray area. If we could go to the next slide. So let me just, kind of set the scene here, I wanted to kickstart this by throwing out a few of the different legal privacy concerns that have been raised. Dr. Reardon's mentioned a few of these, you know, that the idea of the surveillance state of both the state surveilling its citizens, but also the businesses. Some of the concerns with the apps has been data creep or mission creep, that you collect the data for one purpose, but then it's used for another. And we've seen this recently with, for example, Singapore is Trace Together app, which is what the Alberta one is modeled on. The data was recently used by the police to investigate a murder. And in other instances, you know, in some countries, their contact tracing apps are mandatory, such as, for example, in China. South Korea mandated a tracking app to enforce quarantine. Some of the other questions would be the effectiveness of these apps, which we'll look at. And effectiveness, I'm talking about in a legal sense, and also the technological safeguards, which I think Dr. Reardon looked at in detail with you. Thus far, the tracing apps have not been used in Canada in the way that was initially speculated in the spring. They're not used, you know, they're not mandatory. They're not used to monitor those in quarantine or who should be in quarantine specifically. It has not informed decisions about whether to open and shut our economy, but it is a really good case study about the things we should be thinking about when it comes to use of these types of surveillance technologies by the state to achieve public policy objectives. So in a sense, this is a lesson in design, in privacy by design. So if we can look at the next slide. Oh, if we could proceed to the next slide, that would be great.
Sorry, I'm just running into a problem here. Just give me 1 second. Sorry.
Well, the next slide was just a quote anyway, so I can say to you because it's short and sweet. And it was referring to you to the idea of privacy, and that is that the most striking thing about the right to privacy is that nobody seems to have any clear idea of what it is. We don't know exactly what privacy is, and so it makes it an incredibly complicated area to create law. And it's one of the big stumbling blocks to creating cohesive and privacy laws, that we don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about privacy. But if we go to the next slide, I quite like legal scholar Ari Waldman kind of talks about two traditional approaches to privacy, and it's the idea of freedom from something and freedom for something. So freedom from something would be from surveillance, from humiliation, freedom from public exposure. It's the idea of a right to be let alone, which is kind of the quintessential conception of privacy. So at its core, this is really the idea of privacy as seclusion, you know, that walls and doors are there to protect the privacy in our bathrooms and in our homes, and clothing is kind of a cloak for the parts of our body that we do not want to be seen. Freedom from something is different. It sees privacy as a positive right, to be free to make choices, to be true to yourself, to develop your identity and your personality, and to realize your potential. And so depending on which of these approaches is taken to privacy, it can be things like, you know, a right to be let alone, which I mentioned, a right to control the boundaries of what is known about you. That's a particularly popular one. A right to your identity, a right to have the context and situation respected, even a right to secrecy, a right to develop your personality away from prying eyes, a right to obscurity. In the context of tracing apps, there's one that really resonates, which is a right to control the data that we cannot stop generating. So if we go to the next slide, I outlined for you the legal frameworks that are relevant for contact tracing apps. So privacy is a human right. It's protected in international human rights instruments, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not a legal model as much as a kind of normative force. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In Canada, privacy is protected in a variety of ways. One would be the Charter, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today. I'm going to focus on Section 8. but privacy is also protected in another provision, Section 7. Privacy is protected through data protection laws, and that's going to be quite important. I'm going to bounce around and talk about that as a comparison a little bit today. The idea of the privacy commissioners are federal ones. We have an Alberta privacy commissioner, and they do not have the power to address charter violations. Those are only through the courts. Rather, these privacy commissioners have kind of more of a limited scope. So in Alberta, they're an office of the legislature. They have a legislative mandate. They kind of provide advice on the protection of privacy and also enforce very specific legislation for both public and private sectors. So this shows that there are limits to the charter's reach. And when we're examining contact tracing, it might not always be that there's a charter complaint that you really want to make as much as a complaint to a privacy commissioner. And the other privacy law here would be the Tort of Privacy. These are civil wrongs. This is when an individual could sue another individual or a business entity or the government for invading their privacy. Interestingly, this is becoming quite a well-developed kind of cause of action in other provinces, but in Alberta, it's not clearly established. We actually have a tort of privacy here. It's inevitable that it will happen, but we are not there yet. So if we could go to the next slide. What I want to do now is look a little bit closer at Section 8. This is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So I'm going to kind of set up the law, how to think about it, and then really look a bit closer at some of these apps. So Section 8 states everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. So it's quite a simple provision. It is rooted in this idea of unreasonable search and seizure law, and this is important because it means that the foundational legal concepts of our charter right to privacy really have developed in the context of criminal law on whether a police search was legal. This is also the approach in the United States Constitution. It is not the approach in Europe. So in Europe, it is a much broader, more explicit right to privacy set out in the European Convention of Human Rights. And so a lot of the big cases are both criminal and kind of civil cases. So there's two things I want you to understand then about how Section 8 operates. First is that we've had all kinds of fascinating cases in the last, I think there's just been a ramping up of them in the last 6 years or so. But again, they're all criminal. So we don't actually have a lot of guidance on a charter challenge for a non-criminal invasion of privacy, such as, for example, government deployment of contact tracing apps. It's that kind of gray area that I was mentioning. The charter, though, is a powerful rhetorical instrument. It guides the government and the public on what to balance between privacy and some sort of competing right. For example, in trying to decide whether to use a contact tracing app in the first place and trying to assess what the appropriate design should be. It tells us what the privacy choices should be. And so the second point I wanted to make about Section 8 is that the Charter governs the relationship between citizens and the state. So it applies to government action, not between individuals and individuals and individuals and businesses. So that means that the Charter would only directly apply, at least, to the government's obligations concerning contact tracing apps. You would not be able to make a charter challenge against Apple or Microsoft for their design decisions. You maybe could sue them for invasion of privacy. You could be that test case we need in Alberta. All areas of the law are also supposed to be developed with kind of these charter values. So if you sued Apple or Microsoft, the charter would be part of that discussion because it kind of informs the development of the law. It's just not the basis of a cause of action. So let's look at substance then. Traditionally, Section 8 protects territorial privacy, so there'll be privacy of your home and something like that. Personal privacy, so think of the privacy of your body, for example. And then informational privacy. So sheltering intimate details about your health, your sexual orientation, your friendships, your political views, and so on. So whether contact tracing apps might invade privacy is a question of informational privacy. So let's look at then the next slide. We're going to look a bit closer now at informational privacy. So Section 8 protects a biographical core of personal information. So it's that idea I mentioned about revealing intimate details about, say, your lifestyle or your movements or choices. So the question with contact tracing apps would be, do they, implicate the biographical core of personal information? And really it depends on the way the app is designed and used, which is why the kind of work that Dr. Reardon is doing and what he revealed today is so important to inform then a charter analysis. So depending on the way the app's designed or used, it might collect personal data, it might, collect personal identifiers, it might be vulnerable to the revelation of that information. We'll look a little closer at that in a bit. What the analysis turns on is reasonable expectation of privacy. Subjectively, did the person have a reasonable expectation of privacy? And if they did, then looking at the totality of the circumstances, was that expectation reasonable? And then the question is, okay, did the state violate the reasonable expectation of privacy? So this isn't just a descriptive question. Courts look at it normatively about what Canadians ought to expect for their privacy. So once this infringement is established, the question is whether that infringement can be justified. So essentially that despite the infringement, it's still constitutional. So let's look at the next slide, and we're going to look at Section 1. This has been in the news quite a bit lately. So Section 1 tells us that these rights we have, this right to privacy, they're not absolute, that there are reasonable limits on these rights, that these rights have to be balanced against the interests of society. And so the question is, well, how exactly do we do that balancing? So Section 1 is on the screen, and it says, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only, and this is the key language, to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This language is similar to the various international human rights instruments. It is the same kind of balancing act as the European Convention on Human Rights. They all say, okay, let's look at the necessity and the proportionality of the act. In Canada, we use what's called the Oakes test. And it basically asks, is there that it says that a limit on the right to privacy should have a legal basis, that there should be strong justifications for restricting a right, and it should be proportionate. So the test is also set out on your screen, and it's essentially, is there a pressing and substantial objective? And were the means used proportionate? And they look at, was there a rational connection between what they did and the objective? Did it minimally impair rights? And now let's balance, what are the benefits of it versus the detriment? So in the context of contact tracing apps, the question would be, okay, what is the objective of the contact tracing app? Is there proportionality between this objective, which, is pretty clear, isn't it, of public health and safety? Is it proportionate to the means used? How the app was designed? How it's kind of governed? Is the limit rational? Does it minimally impair rights? Do the benefits of this app outweigh whatever the risks are or the detriment? So let me give just a quick context then. There have been, as I mentioned, several privacy and technology cases that have been before the courts recently. And in fact, they were before the Supreme Court of Canada. So to give you an idea of some of the decisions, the court has held that, for example, it was unconstitutional for the police, it was not unconstitutional. So it was constitutional for the police to collect heat images of a house suspected of being a grow-up. The court has held that we have a right to privacy in our IP addresses, in our home and personal computers, even to some extent shared computers, that we have a right to privacy in our text messages, even once they are received by some recipient. We have a right to privacy in our mobile phones. But in that particular case, the police can search it in special circumstances. More recently, the court held that we have a right to privacy in our social media communication. So these are the kinds of cases that have been coming before the court. So now let's look closer then. Let's take all of this and start thinking about these apps. So if we go to the next slide, and this is kind of my last substantive slide, but it's where I'm really spending the most time here. It is, you know, let's talk about charter principles then here. The chances are that some of the ongoing issues here would likely be addressed actually through privacy commissioners. But the charter as a principle document tells us how to kind of analyze and balance these different, you know, these competing rights. And they also draw from international human rights principles, that idea of necessity and proportionality that I mentioned. Even in some of the privacy commissioner assessments of these contact tracing apps, you know, for example, the federal review, it looked at kind of the specific legislation and obligations there, but also drew from, you know, charter principles. So Dr. Reardon outlined some of the technological concerns that create both privacy and cybersecurity risks. Let's look here at some of these legal considerations. So, you know, we start with the idea of, well, what is the objective of these apps? You know, there is a strong public health goal of using contact tracing apps, notionally, right? To trace and notify individuals who might have been exposed. You know, they have not been used as initially imagined back in April, at least in Canada. And they're generally used as kind of exposure notification apps, at least the federal one. There's equally a strong privacy right at stake. There is a risk of being tracked, of being surveilled, both by state authorities and private entities, a risk of data being used for purposes other than for which it was collected, of data being held for longer than was necessary, or more personal information than necessary being collected. So what then does the charter ask of the government to be charter compliant? And it's that it designed the app in the most privacy protective way to meet the objective of public health. It doesn't mean that it has to be the most protective way for privacy. It has to be weighed and meaningful in the context of the health objective. Okay, so how do we assess that? We look at essentially the privacy strategies they deploy, the privacy choices. So let's look a little bit closer at the apps. One, they're voluntary. So this is important because it wasn't entirely clear that this would be the case. Initially, at least, you know, and as we saw at the beginning of my talk, is that in some countries it has been mandatory. So what this means is that individuals consent to the terms of use. But this is the sticky point. Consent should be based on adequate information. There has been pressure to download the app, so it might also not seem quite as voluntary as it looks on the face of it. I mean, although if we're clear, in Alberta, the pressure hasn't exactly worked because there's not a lot of take-up of the app. And then we have to look at that adequacy of the information, because while it seemed that the information was adequate, and certainly that has formed the basis of really the assessments then in a separate context of say, the privacy commissioners, Dr. Reardon shows that there are many privacy and cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And so the question that we have to ask then is whether the individuals who are given clear and fulsome information exercise consent freely, and whether the state really is implementing some sort of accountability mechanisms. So since it is voluntary, though, it does balance some of the concerns and questions about, you know, for example, whether it's effective. including things that only newer Android and app users can use the app. It is alarming, though, that in Alberta, and this was just something I pulled from the news from a few days ago, I think that the Alberta app's only been downloaded 260,000 times since May and only used in 20 cases. And the federal app has been downloaded 5.2 million times and used to contact about 4,200 people exposed. Another stat I saw is that only 2% of people who tested positive for COVID-19 in Canada have activated the federal app. So a study out of the University of Oxford said that in order for these apps to be effective, we need about 60% of the population to use it. And some other studies have said it's actually a much higher percentage of the population. In charter terms, you would be asking whether the benefit of the app to the public then outweighs its drawbacks, and that brings in questions about its effectiveness. Let's look then at some of the personal information concerns. The Alberta app provides information directly to contact tracers. So Dr. Reardon talked about this as kind of more centralized system. This is also one of the reasons why Alberta prefers it, as opposed to the federal one, which is decentralized. But what that means is that the Alberta approach collects more detailed personal information that it then uses. So in charter terms, it's a question of minimal impairment. So the question to ask is the government choosing the most privacy protective option in light of the health and safety objective? So the Alberta Privacy Commissioner, in the context of her legislative mandate, assessed the app and she had a much better chance of looking at it closely than, of course, I would. And so her assessment is, it's using a consent-based approach. It limits the collection of health and personal information when registering to use the app. There are efforts to mitigate secondary uses, and therefore the app was kind of reasonably balancing privacy concerns based on privacy legislation. The worries she expressed were generally was the cybersecurity risks. It was the all-around functionality of the app, and also some of the security risks created. So in contrast, the federal app simply alerts other users if they've been in close proximity to someone with COVID-19. So at least on its face, it's more privacy protective, but noting, of course, the enormous, privacy and security vulnerabilities, of course, Dr. Reardon just identified for you. But it's not collecting personal information exactly, and does not provide the government directly location information. So the question might be what the technological risks or security risks might be, or claims might be vis-a-vis Apple and Google. So again, there's no charter claim against these companies. So the appropriate domain there would then be a complaint to the Privacy Commissioner, whether provincial or federal. As against the government, let's talk about this almost federally for a moment. The federal Privacy Commissioner had confirmed that because there is no collection of personal information, that their legislation that they look at, the Privacy Act, does not apply. But let's talk about it in terms of and I'm just kind of playing and working this through. In terms of the risks Dr. Reardon identified, it would be a novel case against the government, whether charter or, something else. For the government, commissioning an app that then doesn't work in a sense as intended, right? Whose fault would that be? And I don't have an answer to that. So this comes back to that gray area I was talking about. For example, as it stands, the advice is that the risks of a user being identified using the federal app are low. And I think that one of the avenues through this is thinking about it, is, opportunities almost to audit apps. This is generally outside the remit of the charter. This would be more the realm of kind of the roles of privacy commissioners. However, there was a recent cell phone searches case where the Supreme Court of Canada said that if the police is going to use its search incident to arrest power to search a cell phone, that there should be an accountability framework in place, so that maybe provides some avenue for charter challenges for, based on meeting accountability frameworks. So I'm going to leave that here and see what discussion we might have and answer your questions. I mean, ultimately, these contact tracing apps, in legal terms, they were promised to be this, controlling device in a way to help reduce some of the incidences of COVID-19 and ultimately help kind of end the pandemic sooner. It is unclear just whether it is offering any benefit, and it might be that a small reduction in numbers is worth it. But of course, then based on maybe the reduced benefit and identifying some of the concerns raised by Dr. Reardon, that shifts the nature of some of the conversations we might have about that legal balancing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Laidlaw. I'm so sorry about the technological issues.
Okay.
So, Professor Reardon, if you want to join us with your video. So if anyone has any questions, doesn't look like we have many yet, but you can use the Q&A function. Just hit Q&A at the bottom of your screen and you can enter your questions there. We'll be able to see them. So perhaps I'll start off with the one question that's there, and then we'll see what turns up. So the first question that I have is, does using the app give authorities access to my browsing history, my contacts, my social media involvement?
I mean, that would be an app by app basis, but generally no. So these, at least on the mobile phone environment, the access to contacts is controlled by permission. If an app doesn't have that permission, then it can't access it. But there's nothing preventing a country from making an app that also has access to contact information and collecting it. That's not a technical challenge, but I would be shocked if either the Canadian or the Alberta one had that.
Thank you so much. So I don't see any more questions coming, so I don't know if either of you maybe have some final comments you want to make or expand upon your points.
I can't think of any additional points or questions. I just thank you, Joel. I really found it quite interesting, some of the recent work you were doing, and it's informing my thinking here today on the fly.
Oh, we have a question now. It says, I'm overwhelmed with reading the fine print on every app. Is it reasonable for me to be able to understand all the fine print? Should there be a balance there?
So I'll jump in here and from a kind of some of the legal perspective. It has been an enormous amount of legal debate and kind of policy debate about the fine print, because I don't read it either. Nobody does. And that's why I remember wasn't it Apple that had these whole zombie clause hidden away in some of their terms of use, because it was so funny and so ridiculous how long they were, that they had whole clause about when the apocalypse comes, this is what's going to happen, because it was such a joke. This is what's happening, the changes in the law. There were changes in the law out of Europe with the Gdpr, if you might have heard of. This is the private sector privacy legislation. We have a new bill federally for new private sector privacy legislation that also proposes some of the same ideas, which is this: clear language, simplified language, to be able to communicate to users exactly what the privacy risks are. But let me just tell you what the downsides are. The risks are often so complex, and there's so many of them, that they talk about it sometimes as kind of the paradox of the privacy paradox of all of this, and the transparency paradox, that we need it to be clear to you what the risks are, but inevitably, almost to be clear and to keep it short and sweet, make sure we all read it, including me, is end up leaving out some pretty important information. So there, you will start seeing, I think, shorter statements to comply with the new law if it ends up passing. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's telling you everything you need to know.
Yeah, I would say that these terms of services do not appear as though they are negotiated by consumers in their best interest, but rather just these ultimatums. I've read a bunch of them in my research, and often I'm surprised because my, intuition going in is like, oh, of course they're meant to be read by no one or understood by no one. I often find some of them are just clear. They're like, we do this, we collect this information, and it's just like, whoa. And I wanted to see like why they were collecting some information, to see it just spell out. We collect Bluetooth Low Energy for disease prevention research. Okay, well, now I know why they're doing that. Quite clear. I think the only thing that consumers can have is consumer protection, because these are not negotiated contracts, and there's no point to read them because you're bound by them. You can either just not use it. So if your decision is either to waste your life reading these and then still using it anyways, or not using any technology whatsoever, the only real protection is that some practices that they claim to do are just illegal, and then a consumer action can be taken against them.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that there's, we're not there yet in the law, but there, certainly has been scrutiny about the fact that these are these kind of contracts of adhesion or whatever, and they're not exactly freely negotiated. And generally there's the problem is the idea of interfering with the market and contract freedom. And that used to be the view. I mean, there were a few cases back in the day in Canada where they were like, I don't care how egregious the terms are. Online, you choose to abide by them or not. But I think the tide is turning on that. Certainly the consumer protection issues now are so profound that I'm kind of waiting to see where the developments are in this space.
Thank you so much. So we have a question specifically for Professor Reardon.
I just read it, so yeah, I can take that. So basically, what happens is in the decentralized version, if you publish your key, that is, if you contract COVID and you make your key available to the central authority, that is then available to anyone on the planet to then reconstruct all the things that you would have said. So the attack that allows you to do a de-anonymization of a person involves first somehow collecting this information by having sensors all over to actually read the beacons that you put out there. And then when you actively opt to publish your key, you make those linkable, they've already been collected. Now in the centralized approach, what ends up happening is you're putting out all of these random broadcasts, but what happens is if somebody contracts COVID, what they do is they tell the central authority everyone else that they've heard, not the things that they've said, but the things that they've heard. So in this case, the only person who learns any information is the central authority. So they know for every sick person, all of their encounters with other people, that social network, the central authority knows that. But in the decentralized model, if you publish your key, then anyone who collected things you've emitted in different places is able to link them to your identity. I hope that clarifies that.
So this looks probably more like for Professor Laidlaw. It says, what are your thoughts on the implications that arise from the GDPR's right to be forgotten in the context of contact tracing apps?
Trying to think of whether it applies, because I mean, one of the issues is that notionally no data is being collected about you. So there's, I mean, and this is putting aside what has been revealed by Joel, right? So if we're looking at decentralized system and we are looking at, say, what data is gathered about you, the state is not gathering any information about you. And again, the GDPR, for example, only applies to the private sector, so it's not about governments. Actually, I should check that again. We have it divvied up between the two. I need to look at the GDPR again. But it's a very restricted right to be forgotten. It's not this broader concept that we've understood it in a social sense. So I don't think it's particularly helpful here. But what I think is the concern is the threads, right? And this is sort of what Dr. Reardon was talking about here, is that if this information is going out about you, you have no control of what's being done about it, and you have no control to be able to take it back. So the only option is essentially to, I guess, uninstall the app. And I guess that's the best that you could do. I mean, I'm not going to answer the technological aspects. That isn't going to be my particular area. So I would say it has somewhat limited application to some of the stuff that we're talking about.
Thank you. So it looks like there's a few more questions for Professor Reardon. One says, is it fair to say the only protection for attacks via decentralized apps is to find the apps that are collecting these Bluetooth signals and delist them from the app stores?
So basically, the idea is that these attacks are known by the designers of the system. And the argument that they are impossible is a combination of they cost too much to do, and you can catch the person doing it and arrest them. So we can find apps that are collecting this information. We can remove them from the App Store. Google can update their operating system. They've made some improvements in Android 11 that actually addresses some of these issues, like stopping the background collection of location data. But Android 11 is used by less than 1% of mobile phones, and most mobile phones running Android are running outside of a patching lifecycle. There's just so many phones that are out there that the attacker could use. And if an app gets delisted, I don't know if the app gets deleted off everyone's phone. So the point is that there's so many ways an attacker could leverage this attack if they were motivated, and it doesn't cost nearly as much as it was believed to have cost. So of course, implementing these attacks, stopping the ability to do Bluetooth scanning at an operating system level, that'll help. Removing apps that are obviously doing it, that'll help. But there's just so many possible ways of getting your code running in people's phones that is actually the surveillance capital ecosystem functioning as intended. Right? That's how apps make money. That it seems like a bit of a challenge to ensure that every single phone is properly patched when we know they're not, and that patches for privacy are not treated the same as patches for security. If you have a security vulnerability, it'll get patched over the air. If you have a privacy fix, that comes the next time you update your operating system to the next version of Android. So the privacy is just not treated in the same way.
Well, and I'll just jump in to say that what I thought was really interesting when you talked about the privacy and security vulnerabilities when combined with looking at like the app ecosystem, that there were other apps that kind of could gather that particular information almost in combination. You could be identified. And I don't even think in law we really have a good avenue to look at that, because it's that persistent problem of, you know, that the surveillance capitalist state and all these different players being involved in it by creating that vulnerability. And that's a really uncomfortable prospect in a legal system when you're usually just talking about whether one particular priority has fallen below what was expected of them or engaged in problematic conduct.
Yeah, the thing about this Bluetooth collection, and again, it's not that they were collecting it to do these attacks on contact tracing systems, but they're collecting other people's information and sending it. Like, it's not the case that your phone is spying on you and, you know, that's your fault. It's someone else's phone is running Xmode's code that's recording your phone because it's near it and uploading it to Xmode. And that's why the US government was interested, that's why ICE was interested in this data, because they're getting a lot of access to Americans or non-Americans that they can then do actions against. And so that's why it became so much worse as a concept in my mind, because it's not your data, it's you're now a vehicle for other people's privacy to be compromised. And at this point, you don't even need like 1% of the population could be running this attack code. It doesn't need to be 90% for this attack to work. You just need a bunch of people in the right place, not every single person. So.
So I have another question for Professor Reardon here. It says they're asking, they said it's still unclear to them which is more secure, centralized or decentralized.
Excellent. The answer is it depends. So yeah, there's no definitive answer there. The point is that they're different in different ways. So in the centralized system, if you have strong faith in the government's ability to secure the database and that they're not going to use the data for purposes other than what was explicitly presented, and they're transparent about it, it would probably be a better better situation. In a jurisdiction where the government's forcing you to use the app anyways, it probably doesn't matter then that they're getting this information. So it's in that sense, it's unclear. So the threat is different. In the centralized version, the threat is the government agency, and in the decentralized version, the threat can come from anyone on the planet. So in that sense, it is a different threat, and the effects are different. So in the decentralized version, if you don't publish your encryption key, that is, you don't cooperate with the health authority, you have very little risk as a result. It's only by linking it that someone else who had collected it can de-anonymize you. Whereas in the centralized system, just using the app means that someone who listened to your beacon at some point can report it. So it's not a clear this is better than that, but they exist in a different spectrum, and so it's hard to justify exactly which one would necessarily be better. But I would say that one thing, the Canadian app is open source, and open source means you can look at the code and read it. It's based on an open source project, but the Google Apple notification system that it's based on, which it uses, that's not open source, and no government's ever asked them to open it up to see what it does, which is surprising. And the Android operating system, the thing that actually runs the phone, that's open source. So everything's open source except this thin thing that Google provides that does the exposure notification that is basically trust us. It's what we say it does. And in the Alberta app, it's closed source. So Alberta used public money to develop this app, but I'm surprised that it's not available for free, that anyone can just look at the app and see how it works or build on it or make a similar version somewhere else. It's closed source, so a private company made it, and it's not available to the public, unlike the Canadian one, which is.
I think this is probably a question for Professor Laidlaw. They don't specify which act they're talking about, but they say, are you optimistic that this new act with the higher fines will lead to more case decisions on privacy dealing with private sector and not just criminal law?
Yeah, so this is, let me divvy up two things here, because so the mention of this new act is Bill C-11, and so this is the proposed new private sector privacy legislation. So this is what the privacy commissioners would be the federal privacy commissioner's mandate. And the privacy commissioner does not have that much power, and this act would change that and give not the privacy commissioner, but essentially almost this tribunal, this fine-making power. So I think it'll make it a much stronger regulator. I think it is long overdue. We are seeing that there's a movement of this kind of hardening of the regulatory role of these agencies. The Gdpr brought that in. Criminal law is not within the mandate of the privacy commissioner, nor is it this new act. So the criminal law aspect, that's just the charter. So the charter unreasonable search and seizure section in section 8 is that our constitutional right to privacy between us and the state has primarily developed in the area of criminal law.
Thank you so much. So it looks like there's another question for you as well. It says, is it fair to say that a charter challenge against the Alberta app would be most successfully argued on the basis that the app is not effective due to low use and download rates as is required under section 1?
I think that in the end, the lack of effectiveness of the app would not be determinative. I think it's a factor we look at to say what is, to say this isn't even doing what it's supposed to do. But it would have to be an enormous, not enormous, but a significant privacy risk and infringement, and a real strong arming, in a sense, for use of this app to really create that imbalance. And then if you're looking at those competing factors and they're really weighing out, then it's like the effectiveness, I think, would come in as sort of just a side note of it's not even there, it's not even achieving its objective. Because you can imagine what the response of the government would be that would just dismiss it immediately is, well, we want people to take it up. Just because it's effective right now doesn't mean it's not going to be in a few months or something like, I mean, whatever it is, right? So I put that in there not as a primary argument, but I think as just a general issue when we're trying to think, almost when the government's designing these apps, what is our objective? Is this going to help us achieve our goals? And what are the privacy concerns? And I think some of the security concerns that we need to weigh out.
Thank you. And just while we're on that topic, someone had asked if you would be able to repeat the stats about the actual download and use of the federal and Alberta apps. I don't know if you have that handy.
I do actually, yeah. So I'm looking at the question now. Is the actual use of the federal and Alberta stats? Yeah, and it was a news article in the last week, so I thought, ooh, how timely for this talk. And it was, Alberta app has been downloaded 260,000 times since May and only used in 20 cases. That seems funny to me. I didn't even think the Alberta app was available in May. Joel, do you recall?
I think it was May-ish.
Was it May-ish?
I don't recall now, no.
The federal app has been downloaded 5.2 million times and has been used to contact about 4,200 people. Thank you for that question. That was much easier to answer than some of the others.
All right, it looks like I have another question from Professor Reardon. It says, does turning off Bluetooth do anything to protect my privacy?
Yeah, so that's actually quite interesting. So it does, in the sense that it turns off the Bluetooth radio. So your phone, if it's on, will be broadcasting out information periodically, and this is how it's able to find devices and connect to devices. So I don't use Bluetooth. So if I do, I turn it on and use my headphones or something and then turn it off. But typically I don't use it. But interestingly, turning off location, which is the GPS on your phone, that is really just a battery saving thing. It's like it stops using your GPS coordinates, or it stops doing active GPS resolution of your location. But there's other ways to get your location. It can be triangulated from cell phone towers, and it can be triangulated from Wi-Fi routers, the things that you connect to get internet. These Wi-Fi routers have MAC addresses, which is just a serial number, and the internet knows where they all are. There's databases that link MAC addresses to physical location, and routers don't typically move around, and this is why it works. And this is exactly why all those companies are collecting this information. Why they're collecting location and Wi-Fi router MAC addresses is that then they know where these are and they can build these databases. So when you turn off your location, at least on an Android phone, it's still able to track your location using these other means, and still does. So if an app wants location, it will give it the location that it has available to it based on Wi-Fi router information and cell phone tower information, but not GPS information. So the mental model I think that many people have is that if they turn off location, it's a privacy toggle, but it's not, in fact.
That's quite interesting. Thank you.
For Bluetooth, rather, to answer the direct question, it is. So turning off Bluetooth turns it off, as far as I'm aware.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's all the questions. I don't know if there's a last call for questions, if anyone wants to try to put one last question. We're getting close to time in any case. I'll just give a moment here in case anyone wants to put in one more question before we wrap up. Not seeing anything come in. I don't know if Professor Reardon and Laidlaw, you want to make any last comments?
Nope. Just thank you. I'm happy to have been invited. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you. All right, so we will wrap up. Oh, I think maybe one more question came in. Nope. It was just a comment that said this was great. Thank you for that feedback. So with that, we'll close up then. I'd really like to thank both Professor Laidlaw and Professor Reardon for coming today and presenting to us. I have to say this was a really interesting and intriguing presentation, even for myself. I didn't know a lot about this, so I think it was really wonderful to have both of you here to both give us information about how these apps actually work so that we can better understand it when we're talking about the legal issues as well. So thank you so much. You both have so much experience, and we really appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge with us. So thank you so much for answering the questions and for your wonderful presentations, and thank you for dealing with the minor technical issues we had there. I'd also really like to thank everyone who attended today for your interest and attendance. We hope that you found this interesting. Hopefully you learned something new and increased your understanding of the Charter and a whole bunch of other topics today. On contact tracing apps and some of the security and privacy issues with these apps. I'd also like to thank Pat Parody, our executive director, and Zara Ahmed, who's our administrator, who sort of helped with some of the advertising and getting this organized and prepared. So thank you so much, everyone. Just a final reminder, we did record this webinar, so if you want to rewatch it later, you want to share it with others who might be interested, it will be on our YouTube and our website soon. And for the attendees, just remember there will be a feedback form that'll pop up once we end this webinar. We would really appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. It helps us for future planning of other webinars, helps us improve what we do with webinars, so we truly appreciate it. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and I wish you all a lovely rest of the day. And hopefully the weather is lovely wherever you are. I know it's quite windy and gloomy in Edmonton, and I believe it also is similarly a little bit wild in Calgary. So thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.